My name is Ann Albert, and I am the Klatt Family Director for Public Programs here at the Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm here to welcome you to this talk featuring Rabbi Dr. Edward Reichman speaking about the collections and history of Philadelphia's Mutter Museum through a Jewish lens. I and some of our resident research fellows here at the Katz Center were lucky enough to enjoy an in-person version of this exploration with the museum as our extremely gracious hosts a couple of months ago. And today we're able to offer a virtual version of that presentation to share access to these insights with many more of you. And we do encourage you to go and explore the museum itself the next time you find yourself in Philadelphia. Rabbi Dr. Reichman is a professor of emergency medicine at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, hello, and holds the Rabbi Isaac and Bella Tendler Chair in Jewish Medical Ethics at Yeshiva University. He received his rabbinic ordination from the Rabbi Isaac Altman Theological Seminary and writes and lectures really frequently, widely, internationally in the fields of Jewish medical ethics and Jewish medical history. As I said, we had the chance to enjoy his introduction to the Mutter Center already. You might want to check out one of his two books. The first is The Anatomy of Jewish Law, a fresh dissection of the relationship between medicine, medical history, and rabbinic literature. And the other one is about pandemics, pondering pre-modern pandemics in Jewish history. So without any further ado, I hand things over to you, Eddie. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Anne. Thank you so much to the Katz Center for coordinating today's events. It is an absolute pleasure to join you today for a lecture which I suspect you did not anticipate seeing, and that is the relationship of the Mutter Museum to Jewish history, Jewish medical history, and I hope by the end of our discussion today, you will know that there is indeed quite a significant connection between the two. I'm going to share with you my PowerPoint. So as Anne mentioned, we had an opportunity with the Katz Fellows, and the fellowship this year is related to Judaism and medicine, to do an in-person tour at the Mutter Museum, which I suspect, but don't have absolute confirmation, that was probably the very first in-person Jewish tour of the Mutter Museum. We are now privy to the first ever virtual Jewish tour of the Mutter Museum today. And I actually asked AI to do a version of what a Jewish Mutter Museum would look like. So here you have before you some of the images which you would find in the Mutter Museum of today, injected with some Jewish imagery, the Jewish star, the candelabra, the menorah, even has a mezuzah in there. The Hebrew is unfortunately gibberish, but we'll work on that for the next version of ChatGPT. But what I wanted to do with you today is to address some of the iconic aspects of the Mutter Museum. For those of you who have been to the Mutter Museum, you will certainly be familiar with these. For those of you who have not been to the Mutter Museum, fear not. We will share with you these collections and what they comprise, and specifically how they relate to the history of Judaism and medicine. We will focus on four sections of the museum: the Hyrtl and the skull collection, conjoined twins, the history of vaccines and vaccination, and anatomy and preserving of human specimens. The Hyrtl collection is clearly one of the most iconic collections in the Mutter Museum. You can see it as soon as you walk in. It's quite striking, quite imposing. And in fact, I will read for you in an article written by Samuel Radville, who was one of the fellows of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, and an article he wrote in 1984. He's a very prominent member, donated his writings, his collections to the museum and the library where they are housed today. And in this article, actually establishing the relationship of Hyrtl to Philadelphia, wrote the first thing that confronts the visitor entering the Mutter Museum of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia is a case full of human skulls that extends the whole width of the upper gallery. In 1874, Dr. Joseph Hyrtl of Vienna had offered for sale, among other things, his collection of 139 craniums from people of 22 different countries. What he describes in this article, actually, is his purchase of a book by Hyrtl, and we'll talk more about that book as it relates to our discussion specifically, that he purchased at Leary's, Philadelphia's famous secondhand bookstore of bygone years. I'm not familiar if this bookstore still exists. Maybe some of you in the audience may know. But he actually found some handwritten letters of Hyrtl in this book that was owned by a physician in Philadelphia. And again, the book itself I will reference in just a few moments. What was the purpose of Hyrtl collecting this skull of 100, this collection of 139 skulls? So according to the museum itself, the Mutter Museum acquired this collection from Viennese anatomist Joseph Hyrtl. Hyrtl's work was an attempt to counter the claims of phrenologists who held that cranial features were evidence of intelligence and personality, and that racial differences caused anatomical differences. This was a very popular field in the 19th century. Hyrtl's aim in collecting and studying the skulls was to show that cranial anatomy varied widely in the Caucasian population, and basically to debunk this myth that intelligence and personality was related to the anatomical features of the skulls. There is, however, a much more sinister collection of skulls specifically related to the Jewish community, compiled by a man whose name is interestingly quite similar to Hyrtl. This was a physician named August Hirt, who was an anatomist at the Reich University in Strasbourg in World War II. And what he did is he went to the concentration camp Auschwitz during World War II and was responsible for the murder of 86 Jews at Auschwitz, whose skeletons and skulls he wished to procure in order to study them to determine their racial features. This project did not come to complete fruition because of the progression of the war, but we have in the Nuremberg trial an account from Wolfram Sievers in 1942, which was submitted to Himmler, and the extract of, which was read at that trial is as follows. We have a nearly complete collection of skulls of all races and peoples at our disposal. Only very few specimens of skulls of the Jewish race, however, are available, with the result that it is impossible to arrive at precise conclusions from examining them. The war in the East now presents us with the opportunity to overcome this deficiency by procuring the skulls of the Jewish Bolshevik commissars who represent the prototype of the repulsive but characteristic subhuman. For those of you who are familiar with the distinction between the Untermenschen and the Übermenschen, we have the chance now to obtain a palpable scientific document. Tragically, the identity of these victims was unknown for many years, and in 2003, Dr. Hans-Joachim Lang, German professor at the University of Tübingen, through some wonderful detective work, succeeded in identifying every one of the 86 victims whose corpses were at the Rijksuniversity in Strasbourg. They received a proper burial, and there are memorial plaques both at the cemetery, the Strasbourg Jewish Cemetery, and at the University of Strasbourg, commemorating this the tragic cause of their demise. Another aspect of the skulls collected in the Mutter Museum are skulls specifically which have holes in them. And they are trephined skulls. So these are skulls who, the holes were not made by the curators of the museum for cataloging purposes. They actually were in the skulls for many centuries ago during the lives of these people. And it's you will find in many anthropology museums, science museums, skulls that have undergone trephining. It's a fascinating history. It's one of the earliest performed surgeries in human history. We know actually that this was performed by physicians or healthcare providers. We know that the patients survived these procedures because there is bone growth in the skeleton subsequent to the placement of the hole, which is a reflection of the fact that they actually survived. And also the trephining continued for quite a period of time. Now, why they were performing trephining is a matter of debate, probably for neurological or psychiatric reasons, likely associated with seizures, people who had seizures or who had psychosis, and were believed to be controlled by spirits, and the placing of the hole in the skull would release the spirits. And in fact, trephining was used for medical purposes today to release blood in the brain as well. And these trephining kits, the Mutter Museum also has an extraordinary collection of tools, medical tools. Amongst them are many trephining kits, which you see here. What connection does this have to the Jewish tradition? Interestingly, in the Mishnah, which is one of the rabbinic texts from the 2nd century of the Common Era, there are discussions about the human body and the corpse. The corpse conveys ritual impurity, which is a matter that needs to be addressed, especially during the times of the temple. People could only enter the temple if they were ritually pure. Exposure to the human corpse is the pure form of exposure to impurity. That constitutes the source of the ultimate source of impurity. So the question is, what conveys impurity? What types of skulls or body remains convey impurity? And a skull can convey impurity, but if the skull is deficient by a certain volume, then it no longer conveys impurity. So there's a debate between some of the great rabbis of the Mishnaic period, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, and according to Beit Hillel, the deficiency needs to be the volume of a makdeach, and makdeach is a drill. And what kind of drill hole would that be? So the Mishnah says, "Bekatan shel rofim," which is the small drill used by physicians, and many people assume that this is the drill used for trephining skulls. So if the skull contained a hole the volume of the average or small trephining drill of the physicians, or larger than that, it would not convey the impurity. This was also discussed in a dissertation in 1869 by Jewish students from the University of Germany, Heisiger in Germany, who wrote his entire dissertation on surgery in the Talmud, and he addressed the issue of trephining in rabbinic sources, and he actually cites even another source in the Talmud, in the Ketubot, where they put some particular spices or medications on the skull to soften the skull, to access the brain, to treat patients for certain conditions. Returning to Hyrtl, Hyrtl was an anatomist and a physician at the University of Vienna. University of Vienna had an extraordinarily high percentage of Jews at that period of time. Probably around 40% of the medical students at the University of Vienna were Jewish. And we know that he had connection with a number of these students. And when he died, actually, in the Medical Review in July of 1894, in an article on reminiscences of Hyrtl, the very first reminiscence in the article is of his relationship with a Jewish student. A correspondent for the Lancet furnishes some reminiscences of the late Professor Hyrtl. His sympathy with student life is well known, and many stories in this connection are told. A Jewish medical student named Jerusalem was being examined, and in the hall there was waiting a small crowd of co-religionists. When Hyrtl came out of the examination chamber, he was immediately surrounded by the crowd of young students who asked him the fate of their comrade Jerusalem. Hyrtl, with a plaintive voice and sympathetically shaking his head, said, "Weep, O Israel, Jerusalem has fallen." Now, what I don't know from the context of the article, if Jerusalem actually had fallen, meaning he just fell and he was being sarcastic, or perhaps Jerusalem had not survived. It's not clear from the context of the article. But we know he had close relationships with some Jewish students. In fact, there's one particular student whom he promoted and recommended, and even succeeded Hyrtl himself as the chair of anatomy in Vienna. This is a very exceptional student. His name was Emil Zuckerkandl. And the first term of his medical studies, his exceptional dexterity at dissection attracted the attention of the highly critical Hyrtl, who rarely built close relationship with the students and never established a school. When demonstrating preparations in lectures, he described them as coming from the expert hands of his favorite student, Zuckerkandl. Perhaps the young man's skilled hand and artistic inclination reminded Hyrtl of his own youth. And it was on Hyrtl's recommendation that Zuckerkandl was appointed in Amsterdam's Athenaeum while he was still a medical student. And later on, as I mentioned, he ultimately succeeded Hyrtl himself as the chair of anatomy in Vienna. The book within which the letter of Hyrtl was found by Samuel Radbell, which I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion, was a book which connects Hyrtl to the Jewish community in a very specific way. Hyrtl wrote a book about anatomical terminology, and the book is called Das Arabische und Hebräische in der Anatomie, what it did was it reviewed the anatomical terms and their etymologies in Arabic and Hebrew language, which is quite remarkable. And in fact, here you have a copy of this book being held by Dr. Aaron Warman, who is a prominent surgeon in Philadelphia and also a member of the oversight committee for the Mutter Museum. This is his personal copy. Hyrtl went through hundreds of anatomical terms, determining that their etymologies were related to previous Hebrew words or Arabic words. In an article I wrote with Dr. Fred Rosner some years ago, published in the History of Medicine, Journal of the History of Medicine Allied Sciences, we wrote an entire article on the Luz bone, which is a bone believed to be an indestructible bone in the Jewish tradition, has a fascinating history to itself, and believed to be indestructible, and will survive until the time of the resurrection, where people will be resurrected from that remaining bone. It debates how that bone survived the Holocaust, and there are some accounts that small bones survived even the crematoria, and some suggest that those bones were the traditional Luz bone that are indestructible and will survive till the time of the resurrection. So Hyrtl has a lengthy discussion of the Luz bone in his work. This work was also mentioned extensively in the 19th century. Hyrtl is a very prominent figure, and a number of Jewish figures referenced that specific work and other of Hyrtl's works. There was a book written on anatomy, Ramach Evarim, the 248 limbs. We'll get to that, to the source of this notion that there are 248 limbs in the body according to the Jewish tradition, in just a few moments. But someone wrote an entire book on the 248 limbs. It was actually published, for those of you who are familiar with the Hebrew language, Ramach is the numerical equivalent of 248. It was published in Tuf Reish Mem Ches, which has the letters 248 in it as well. I often wondered if he rushed it to publication or delayed the publication. But Hyrtl is mentioned there in the discussion of the sesamoid bone and his etymology of sesamoid. He is also mentioned in Moshe Perlman's Midrash Refuah, also on biblical and Talmudic medicine. And the Malbim, who is a figure known to some of you perhaps for his commentary on the Torah, on the Bible and the prophets, also mentions Hyrtl, and as does Zisman Muntner, who is a prominent Jewish medical historian of the 20th century. All reference Hyrtl, as do a number of others. As to the value of Hyrtl's linguistic analysis today, Gerrit Bos is one of the giants in the field of Jewish medical history and general medical history, who has translated the works of Maimonides in the consummate volume of translation and of all the original Arabic works of Maimonides translated into English, and is intimately familiar with etymology of medical terms throughout the medieval period. And his comment about the Hyrtl study, an early study, is Joseph Hyrtl's Das Arabische und Hebräische in der Anatomie, which was published in 1879. Although it was a pioneering work, it is of little use for scholars today, he argues, for the following reasons. It only deals with a small number of terms. Most of the terms derive from only one source, and furthermore, it does not specify particular translations. So it has been updated, but nonetheless, Hyrtl's work was definitely a pioneering work and an important contribution. Hyrtl also cited other Jewish sources, and he cited particularly multiple times in multiple works an individual whose name was Benjamin Wolf Ginsberger. Benjamin Wolf Ginsberger was a student of Albrecht Haller. Albrecht Haller was one of the founders of physiology. Ginsberger lived in the mid-1700s, graduated the University of Göttingen in 1743. Actually, the very first Jewish student to ever attend that university. And his dissertation topic as a Jewish medical student in 1743 in Germany was on, this is the English translation, this is the original Latin from 1743, inaugural medical disputation on medicine from the Talmud. Quite remarkable, one of the earliest works ever written on medicine in the Talmud. We actually showed a dissertation from the mid-1800s earlier on surgery. And in fact, Albrecht Haller, his mentor, quotes him and his dissertation in his work on anatomy. And in addition, Ginsberger's works were subsequently cited in other medical student dissertations. This is a dissertation from a student, Meyer Levin from University of Halle, who was a Jewish student who wrote his dissertation on a Jewish topic. And also he was cited by non-Jewish students as well, just a few years after it was published. Another major iconic collection in the Mutter Museum is the collection of conjoined twins. And in addition to the many specimens of conjoined twins that are contained in the museum, it also contains a cast of the bodies of Cheng and Eng Bunker, the famous Siamese twins born in Siam, today Thailand, who many of you are familiar with. They're being exhibited by circuses, including P.T. Barnum, for many years, and we will discuss some of the fascinating aspects of conjoined twins in rabbinic literature. In fact, by the way, the autopsy of Cheng and Eng Bunker, the Siamese twins, was performed at the Mutter Museum itself before their burial in North Carolina. These are some of the conjoined twins in the collection of the Mutter Museum. The two-headed person, and we'll talk about different configurations of conjoined twins, but the notion of a two-headed person is actually mentioned in the Talmud. Talmud is one of the major works in Judaism, compiled in the 5th century, comprised of many thousands of pages of detailed discourses and rabbinic discussions covering the gamut of rabbinic tradition and law. And in one of these discussions, there is a mention of the two-headed person. Boimine Polimo, my Rabbi, the sage Polimo, or a student Polimo, asked a question of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, who was the redactor of the text of the Mishnah, one of the giants in rabbinic history. And he asked him, in the case of one who has two heads, on which of them does he don phylacteries? So for those of you who are not familiar, phylacteries, or tefillin as we call them, is a religious article that's worn by men in the morning, in morning prayer, and it's wrapped around the arm. It's also placed on the head. So the question was, if a person has two heads, the Talmud's asking, on which one of those heads does he place the head section of the phylacteries? So Rabbi said to him, he thought this was a ridiculous question from a student. He thought he was being flippant and being disrespectful and just trying to make fun and rile up the class. So he said, either exile yourself or accept upon yourself communication, in essence, really throwing him out of class. In the meantime, someone arrived and knocked on the door of the classroom and said, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, my wife just gave birth to a firstborn child that has two heads. There is an obligation to redeem the firstborn male child with the Kohen for 5 coins, 5 slaim, the redemption of the firstborn. How many coins do I have to give to the Kohen? Because this child has two heads. Do I have to give 5 coins? Do I have to give 10 coins? So the Talmud actually engages in a discussion about that. It concludes that he would indeed have to give 10 coins for a particular scriptural analysis, but it doesn't return to the tefillin question. And rabbis over the centuries have debated the tefillin question. For those of you who are familiar with the Chabad tradition, Chabad would answer that Chabad actually puts on 2 pairs of tefillin every morning. Rashi tefillin according to the tradition of Rashi, and the tefillin according to the tradition of Rabbi Tam. So they might suggest that one head would put on the Rashi tefillin and the other head would put on the Rabbi Tam tefillin. The issue of conjoined twins was mentioned over the centuries in rabbinic literature. In the early 1700s, Rabbi Yaakov Reicher was asked about craniopagus twins. There's different forms of conjoined twins. The twins joined at the head are called craniopagus twins. Cheng and Eng Bunker were thoracopagus. They were joined at the thoracic cavity. Here you have these illustrations of these craniopagus twins. I actually, my clinical practice is at Montefiore Medical Center. Dr. Goodrich, blessed memory, who actually died during the COVID pandemic, was one of the world's most renowned pediatric neurosurgeons, and he was famous for separating conjoined twins who were conjoined at the brain, the craniopagus variety, and he not only separated many at Montefiore, but traveled the world separating twins. So he was asked here about which one should wear tefillin, but here, since it's not one body with 2 heads, it's 2 full bodies that are connected by the head, he said they should for sure each wear their own pair of tefillin. And beyond the scope of our discussion, but there are quite lengthy discussions about the analysis of these topics. Inheritance is also a question in the issue of conjoined twins. You may be familiar with the famous Solomonic judgment, the judgment of King Solomon about the baby. There was one baby, and it wasn't clear who the mother of the baby was, and Solomon famously said, "Let us cut the baby in half." That appears actually in the text of the prophets itself, but there's another less well-known judgment of Solomon, which appears in the Midrash, a different set of texts in rabbinic tradition, where there was a 2-headed person who was married. A single-headed person had multiple children, at least one of whom had 2 heads. And when the father died, the 2-headed person claimed a double portion of the inheritance. So they came to Solomon and said, should he indeed have two portions of the inheritance? So Solomon put a blanket over the head of one of the heads and poured scalding water on the head of the other. And when they both screamed simultaneously at the same time, he said, "This is hereby conclusion that you are indeed only one person and will receive one portion of the inheritance and not 2." Rabbis discussed this particular decision and what it reflects, whether neurological connection is what the determinant is, or other things as well. Marriage of conjoined twins is also discussed in rabbinic literature. And in fact, Cheng and Eng Bunker married separate women, had separate families. Here, this is an article I wrote on the topic a number of years ago. Rabbi Yitzchak Schmelkes, he heard about the exhibit in Vienna of this configuration of two torsos, and complete torsos, but only one set of reproductive organs. And these are the Tochi brothers who were being exhibited at that time. And he argues that if this configuration were present for female sisters, the kiddushin, which is the marriage, the ability to legally marry them, to marry either one of the sisters would be invalid, as it would be a marriage for which consummation is legally impossible. As the sisters share one set of reproductive organs, the man would violate the prohibition of cohabitation with his wife's sister at the same time. And this is a form of adultery. Cheng and Eng Bunker were offered separation earlier in their lives. They refused to have the separation. It would have been a relatively easy separation. They were only conjoined at the at the liver and at the thoracic portion of the thoracic cavity. It's amongst the easiest of twins to separate. There is, in fact, a fascinating discussion in Jewish law about the separation of conjoined twins, which relates specifically to Philadelphia, the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and even to the College of Physicians of Philadelphia. And that is a case which transpired in the 1970s of a set of conjoined twins who were born to an Orthodox Jewish couple in Lakewood, New Jersey, and the twins ended up at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And the question was whether they should be separated or not. The complexity arose from the fact that they shared one six-chambered heart. And the determination of the physicians at the time was that if they were to remain unseparated, they would surely die. Both of them would die. However, it was possible to separate them, but in the separation, it would necessitate sacrificing the life of one twin with the possibility of the survival of the other twin. So the question was, would it be permissible to sacrifice one twin for the possible survival of the second twin? This is one of the landmark cases in Jewish tradition. You will find this case quoted to this very day in the Jewish medical ethics literature. I was at a conference just last week, national conference on Jewish medical ethics, and it came up in the lectures and the discussions there. The surgeon at that time was none other than C. Everett Koop, a young picture of which you see in the upper right-hand corner. C. Everett Koop was later became the Surgeon General of the United States. And the family reached out to who at that time was the greatest rabbinic figure in America, and that was Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, whose blessed memory has since passed away. And Rabbi Tendler, who was also very recently passed away, was one of the giants of Jewish medical ethics in the 20th and early 21st century, was the son-in-law of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, was involved heavily in the case. And he writes, "I recall how impressed I was with a statement Dr. Koop made, a statement that, in my opinion, revealed the man's personality and incurred a special merit. When the team of 20 or so professionals were awaiting Rabbi Feinstein's decision, and they were impatient at the time lapse, which interfered with their private professional lives significantly, Dr. Koop quieted the group with the following statement: the ethics and morals involved in this decision are too complex for me. I believe they are too complex for you as well. Therefore, I referred it to an old rabbi in the Lower East Side of New York. He is a great scholar, a saintly individual. He knows how to answer such questions. When he tells me, I too will know." As I mentioned, this is a very complex decision and one that evokes discussion to this very day. I'll just share with you two of the aspects of the legal analysis. So this one, as Rabbi Tendler writes, one analogy which was invoked for the solution of the problem was the parachute analogy. If two men jump out of a burning plane, Rabbi Tendler said in one discussion, the parachute of the first man opens and he falls slowly and safely to earth. The parachute of the second man does not open. As he plunges past his friend, he manages to grab onto his foot and hold on, but the parachute is too small to support both of them. Now they are both plunging to their death. It is morally justified, Rabbi Tendler concludes, for the first man to kick his friend away because they would both die if he didn't, and it was the first man who was designated for death since it was his parachute that didn't open. So this, along with other rabbinic texts, were invoked to apply the notion that if the one of the twins was designated for death, then perhaps it would be okay to sacrifice that twin. Now let me inject here a very key fact which Rabbi Moshe Feinstein asked C. Everett Koop to clarify in the case, and according to those who are familiar with the case, he asked him multiple times and wanted to make absolutely certain that the facts were correct. The question that he asked C. Everett Koop was, is there a difference in terms of the shared heart? Do they both share the heart equally? Or does one really possess the majority of the heart and the other one is sort of a parasite, if you will, or simply tagging along and drawing off the circulation of the other? So based on the physiological understanding of the time and the imaging they did on the twins, C. Everett Koop responded to Rabbi Moshe Feinstein that in fact one twin, the majority of the heart was embedded in the thoracic cavity of that one twin who had a fuller, complete circulation. The other twin really was parasitic, probably would not even survive if the whole heart was placed in their body. And given that notion, that asymmetry, that led Rabbi Moshe Feinstein to make his conclusion, which I'll share with you in a moment. The other rabbinic sources that were marshaled in this discussion were the sources that deal with the laws of the pursuer. And Maimonides actually has a discussion about the laws of the pursuer as they relate to a woman in childbirth. That if a woman is having difficulty during childbirth, one can dismember the fetus in utero and sacrifice the fetus because the fetus is considered similar to a pursuer. This is a fascinating passage that rabbis, thousands of pages of literature have been written just on this passage. Very complex passage, why Maimonides decides to invoke the notion of the pursuer here. But Rabbi Moshe Feinstein drew on this source to render his decision in conjunction with other rabbinic material. And given the physiological reality that this twin was indeed a parasitic twin and that they did not share the heart equally, he came to the decision that this twin was considered a rodef, a pursuer, in conjunction with the fact that this single twin would have died no matter what. So he was really destined for death in any case, so he permitted the separation of the twins on that basis. Later on in 2009, the C. Everett Koop visited the campus of Dartmouth. Actually, I think he was actually at Dartmouth. And he visited the Chabad of Dartmouth to recall that famous case to the students at that time. The case is even perpetuated today in our Jewish equivalent to moot court. High schools have what's called a model Beis Din. Model Beit Din is a Jewish rabbinic court where they have complex cases that they present and are judged upon their presentations. And one of the cases was the famous case of the conjoined twins. In fact, those who won were the Masifta of Philadelphia, maybe because they were closer to the origin of the case, but they won in that competition. Vaccination is another aspect where the collection is an extraordinary collection in the College of Physicians and in the Mutter Museum. This is actually a picture taken by Dr. Ari Weintraub, who's a anesthesiologist at CHOP, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, of Rabbi Usher Weiss, one of the great rabbinic figures in our generation who deals with the issues of Judaism and medicine, who came to the Mutter Museum to see its extraordinary collection. Just a few words about this and about vaccination. This rash, if some of you are physicians, you may or may not recognize this. This is a rash called smallpox. We haven't seen too many small cases of smallpox since the 1970s. And I'll explain why in a second, but in the 18th and 19th century, 300 million people died of smallpox. The reason we don't see smallpox today is one word, vaccination. Today, how many people die of smallpox? The answer is 0. In fact, smallpox was eradicated from the face of the earth. There hasn't been a spontaneous case of smallpox since the 1970s. But the original treatment of smallpox, which was inoculation, presented legal issues in the Jewish community. And here we have some illustration of inoculation. They would take some fluid from the pox of a child suffering from the disease and inject it into a healthy child. And the thought process behind that was that the healthy child would get only a moderate form or mild form of the disease, and wouldn't get the fatal form of the disease. But in fact, the Jewish community suffered from smallpox like everybody else. And one rabbi, Rabbi Nansich, lost 2 of his own children to the disease smallpox, and he wrote an entire treatise to the rabbis at that time asking that they allow this new procedure. Now, what was the issue with the new procedure? The issue with the new procedure was that while it would protect people, it was different in Jewish history because Jewish history allowed physicians to be physicians, and there's a tradition in the Jewish literature and rabbinic literature that's very clear that rabbis have a license to heal. But do they have a license to inject disease into somebody who's healthy, albeit for the purpose of protecting that person from future disease? And when you injected, the initial inoculations could cause mild effects, local effects, but they could also cause this. And this tombstone is not far from where I'm sitting today. I live in Long Island, and this is in memory of Peleg, son of Thomas and Mary Conklin, who died of the smallpox by inoculation, January 27th, age 17 years old. So the question is, the physician who administered that inoculation, is he a healer or is he a murderer? And Benjamin Franklin, where the Mutter Museum is housed in Philadelphia, was reported in his Pennsylvania Gazette. He reported on 72 Bostonians inoculated in March, and only 2 of them died, and the rest recovered in perfect health. And he notes on a personal note that in 1736, I lost one of my own sons, a fine boy of 4 years old, by the smallpox, taken in the common way. I long regretted bitterly and still regret that I had not given it to him by inoculation. And the Jewish literature, one of the more famous responses to this was Rabbi Israel Lipschitz, writing in the 1800s, and allowed inoculation because even though people would die from inoculation, there was a much greater chance that they would survive if they would receive it, the inoculation, rather than contract smallpox spontaneously, which had a fatality rate of 30 to 40%. There was opposition to vaccination. Let me skip a little bit ahead. Edward Jenner ultimately performed one of the greatest experiments in medical history, where he noted that people who contracted the milk maidens who contracted cowpox did not contract smallpox. So he injected the number of people with cowpox, and then subsequently smallpox. I'm not sure if it would have been approved by your local ethics committee or IRB today. I suspect not. But there was opposition to that because people were receiving cowpox to protect them. And here you have people, it's a famous illustration by Gilray, the anti-vaxxer movement, people morphing into cows. Just from the Jewish perspective, there's a painting in this room. It's people here amongst you have probably seen this illustration, but may not have noticed the painting. The painting is a painting of the golden calf. And the question is, what is the golden calf doing there? Does it have to do with anti-Semitism? Perhaps yes, perhaps no. Or perhaps an illusion that they are praying to a false god. There was anti-Semitism associated with that vaccination, and there is much written and discussed about that. Jewish religious exemption to vaccination. The earliest case of religious exemption that I have ever seen was a case of a person who claimed that the Jenner vaccination for smallpox contained a cow, and that cow was a sick cow, and it wouldn't be kosher, and you shouldn't be able to eat. You shouldn't be able to take that vaccination because it included a non-kosher substance. So this was in England, and it was against the law to refuse vaccination. So this Jewish fellow, Mr. Levy, was actually put in jail. Chief prosecutor was also Jewish, felt guilty putting him in jail, turned to the chief rabbi at that time, and the chief rabbi wrote to Mr. Harris, the prosecutor, that Mr. Levy, quote, was not justified in making the statements contained in the letter, that the most competent medical authorities were agreed as to vaccination being a prophylactic against smallpox, and added that its use was in perfect consonance with the letter and spirit of Judaism. And our last topic is anatomy and the preservation of human specimens, which is obviously a major aspect of the Mutter Museum. And for those of you who know and know far more than I do, the museum is reevaluating these collections in varying ways, and there is what's called the post-mortem project, which is an important part of the museum where people are sharing their thoughts, and this is an ongoing evaluation. Here I will share some of the Jewish perspectives on anatomy and the rabbi's understanding of anatomy, and the preservation of human specimens as we conclude our session for today. This I also generated with AI. For those of you who are familiar with the prompt, I asked Dr. Warman what the prompt he thought what the prompt would be, and he immediately immediately knew. There is a famous painting by Rembrandt called The Anatomy of Dr. Tulp, which I will show in just a moment or two. So I prompted it to reconfigure it with using rabbis. So I call this The Anatomy of Rabbi Tulp. Body preservation is already discussed in the Bible. Jacob and Joseph were embalmed. There is much debate in rabbinic literature whether they underwent a complete Egyptian embalming, which is extremely invasive and would violate some biblical prohibitions of desecrating the body, or they underwent some modified form of embalming. We mentioned the number 248. So interestingly, in the text of the Mishnah says explicitly there are 248 limbs in the body, and it enumerates every one of them. Its correlation to our modern understanding of anatomy is not so clear. The reason the Mishnah does this is because it's relevant to laws of purity and impurity, as I mentioned before. The Mishnah is not a medical textbook, but mention these things in as much as they relate to Jewish law. There is actually an early dissection mentioned in the Talmud itself, one of the earliest dissections mentioned in all of history. It's a passage in the tractate Bechorot, and this is the original Rembrandt, The Anatomy of Dr. Tulp. And it records that the students of Rabbi Yishmael did some form of dissection in order to verify experimentally if the 248 limbs, the number 248 that was mentioned in the Mishnaic text, and they actually came to a different number, and the Talmud determines why they came, or debates why they came to a different number, and that's part of a continued rabbinic discussion in the Talmud. Moving into later period of time, the founder of history, the founder of anatomy, considered the founder of modern anatomy, is a man by the name of Andreas Vesalius. Andreas Vesalius, pictured here next to a body on the frontispiece of his classic work, The Fabric of the Human Body. This work actually contains anatomical terms. We talked about Hyrtl's discussion of the etymology of anatomic terms, some of them being related to Hebrew or Arabic, but here, in the very work of Vesalius, we have terms in Latin, in Greek, and we have a term in this language, which I pull out for you here, which is the Hebrew language. And this term is haorti, which refers to the aorta. And according to historians, this figure who was on the frontispiece kind of looks like Moses himself. His name was Lazarus de Phrygius, and he's the one who apparently taught Hebrew or inserted the Hebrew into Vesalius's anatomical works. But apropos the Jewish community, someone has suggested the following in terms of his Vesalius's access to bodies. This is a historiated letter in his work, The Fabric of the Human Body, the Fabrica, and these are putti, or little angels, exhuming a body from a grave. And this flag that the putti is holding has this little circle, and according to Dr. Levine, he suggests that this circle was the circle worn by Jews to identify them as being Jewish, and that perhaps the grave that is being robbed is actually a Jewish cemetery. And in fact, historically, Jewish cemeteries were robbed. Let me see if I can pull that here. And here you have, for example, in London, this was a ticket given out to an average member of the Great Synagogue of London in the late 1700s. And the ticket was printed, but this was written. And it said, Shmo Allah Begoral, your name, his name is written Shlomo Schneider. It is your turn, Shlomo Schneider, to serve as the guard of the local cemetery from dusk to dawn. And if you have failed to do so, you have to find a substitute to cover your call. And if you can't do that, and you don't show up, you will be fined X number of shillings. You see the borders comprised of skull and crossbones and an hourglass. But Vesalius another aspect of the relationship of the Vesalius and Jewish community, and relates specifically to the University of Pennsylvania, is that the University of Pennsylvania houses an extraordinary document, which is the work of Vesalius in Yiddish. And it reflects the fact, the unique aspect, this very university that Vesalius came to was the first university to open its doors to Jews. And Jews came from Poland and from Germany and from France to the extraordinary University of Padua, did not know the language, didn't know Italian, didn't know Latin. So the works of Vesalius himself would have been were translated to give them access. And he certainly had Jewish students sitting in his class, probably in the back row, or Chaim and Yosef, arguing about the anatomy of Vesalius with their Yiddish version. And here are some of the diplomas which the Jewish students of the University of Padua received for another discussion, how the Jews were treated in that university. But let us conclude in our last moments about the dissection and specifically fetal preservation. This is a question, the same medical student that we talked about before, Benjamin Wolf Ginsberger, who wrote that dissertation on Talmudic medicine, wrote a query to one of the great figures in Judaism, Rabbi Jacob Emden in the 1700s, about whether it was permissible for him to perform some form of animal dissection on the Sabbath. And that today is used in discussion of rabbinic analysis of the permissibility of dissection. Fetal preservation, which you find a number of fetuses preserved in the Mutter collection, was discussed in the 18th century in cases of the following. One is preservation by Jacob Ettlinger on preserving a fetus for medical purposes, for medical teaching. And this one was for financial purposes. There's a poor man whose wife had a severe congenitally deformed child, and he wanted to preserve that child and go through the towns and receive money to be able to support his family. In both cases, the rabbis prohibited because of the obligation to bury a fetus and the prohibition of deriving benefit and the concern for exposure to the Kohen, people who are a member of the Kohen tribe, to the impurity generated by the fetus. And our last case is a case of conjoined twins, which occurred in Venice. Dr. Ruderman, who's an important member of University of Pennsylvania and the Katz Center for decades, and a major contributor to the field of Jewish medical history, an iconic figure, who quotes this case of conjoined twins. And this is a decision by Shmuel Katzenelbogen about whether they could take these conjoined twins in Venice and also preserve them and go from town to town. He likewise, while he admitted that a number of people permitted, he himself was inclined not to permit for the reasons we just mentioned. So in conclusion, we've had an opportunity today to discuss the Mutter Museum from an angle, from an approach, which I suspect you wouldn't have anticipated before today's lecture, but I hope after today's lecture you understand why indeed there is quite a rich and storied connection between the Mutter Museum and Jewish history and Jewish medical history. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Eddie. I appreciate it. As the last time, it was an absolute tour de force of information and context and raising so many questions. We are virtually out of time. And so I think with your permission, if we can take just a couple of extra minutes, I want to bring one question from the audience.
With pleasure, with pleasure.
Which I think might be also up your alley. It was a specific question about whether Zucker candle had to be baptized or convert in order to get an appointment at the university. But I actually wanted to ask it as a broader question to see if you could speak a little bit about the position of Jewish medical students in European universities. I know that this is a broad and deep history that you've looked at, so has Professor Ruderman. Can you take us there for a minute or two before we have to leave?
Sure, absolutely. So Anne, it's really an excellent question. I honestly do not know about the particulars of Zuckerkandel. I will speak to the broader issue. There is very complex interplay between Jewish medical students, Jewish physicians, throughout the centuries. They were, on the one hand, allowed into universities to some extent. The University of Padua, as we mentioned, was actually the first European university to officially allow Jews to attend, but even then there was discrimination. They were forced to pay higher fees. The first snow of the season, they had to provide meats to the faculty. Strange anti-Semitic aspects of their practice, but you are right. Throughout much of history, even though they were allowed into the universities, and in fact a very high percentage in the 19th century, late 19th century of these European universities were Jewish students, they were not allowed to advance professionally in their careers. Very often, especially in Germany specifically, as Jews, and they would be forced to make a decision if they wanted to convert or not. And if they converted, they could advance, and if they didn't, even then they were discriminated against. But if they didn't convert, they would be condemned to remain in whatever low positions. And in fact, one of the great figures in Jewish history who talk about vaccines, who actually made a vaccine for cholera and bubonic plague, was a man by the name of Valdemar, or Mordechai was his Hebrew name, Halfkind. Extraordinary figure. He was in Ukraine. He refused to convert, did not advance, ended up being a librarian in the Pasteur Institute because he couldn't get a job officially, and he learned from Pasteur himself and ultimately marshaled this into extraordinary medical advances, despite the fact that he wasn't officially allowed to advance.
Wow, that's an incredible achievement, and it really does speak to the way in which universities, especially medical faculties, have served as a kind of entry point and also a blocking point for Jewish students.
Very true.
I want to thank you again. This was wonderful, and it will be a great resource when it's posted online as well. I want to just once again encourage everybody to go to the Mutter and take what you've learned and what you've heard today there, and think about all of these issues when you're encountering the really thought-provoking collections at the museum. So,
Anne, I just wanted to mention, I'm happy to share the PowerPoint itself for anyone who wants to use it. So I can give it to you, and they can reach out to you, or they can reach out to me, whatever's easier.
that sounds great. Yeah, there's an information email on the web listing for this program on our website. So if anybody wants that, they can reach out to that email and we can get it shared. Thank you. Thank you so
Great,
much.
thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone. See you next time.
Thank you. Thank you.